All right. So my name's Kevin Williams. I work at, well, I'm going to be presenting on Polybase today. Here's a little bit of my contact information on the screen here. If anybody wants to reach out to me. I probably will have the slides either sent out through Lee or post them on Git or something for people to download later if you would like. All right. So who am I? I'm the Business Intelligence Practice Lead at Software Design Partners. We're located out in Chesterfield, Missouri. We do basically custom software as well as business intelligence, building data warehouses and integrations for clients. I've been working with business intelligence for about 5 years now, off and on, mainly doing data warehousing and working pretty heavily with Power BI. A couple years ago, I also achieved a MCSE in data management and analytics. All right, so today I'm going to kind of go over what is Polybase, why would you use Polybase, kind of do a little setup on it, show a demo of how you use it, as well as give you guys some additional resources to be able to go through and learn a little bit more about things. So what is Polybase? So Polybase is a service that is available with SQL Server that virtualizes data from disparate data sources. Some of the great things about why you would use it or what it is it allows you to use SQL Server to process transact SQL or T-SQL queries against external data sources. It even allows for the joining of tables across these data sources. So these data sources can be anywhere from ODBC connections to SAP HANA, Teradata. There's many different data sources that you can connect to natively through SQL now. Without a lot of these, you don't even need any special connectors for. Some other great things is distributed query processing. So you can query multiple different data sources all at the same time across a distributed architecture as well. And it's available on SQL Server on-premise, Azure Synapse Analytics, and in parallel data warehouses. The question I've had asked in the past is it available in regular Azure databases? And no, it is not. And if anybody has any questions while I'm going through this, feel free to ask. They're not going to have any Q&A in particular at the end of this, although we can if you guys want. But if you have any random questions, feel free to ask them. All right, so a little bit brief history about Polybase. Polybase was released with SQL Server 2016. It was a very limited technology back then. It only worked with Hadoop and Azure Blob Storage. It was mainly used for reading like CSV files out of Azure Blob Storage and taking that data through Polybase into a SQL Server database table. The way it works is pretty neat. I'll kind of cover that here in a little while. So in 2017, there wasn't really any updates to it. It was pretty much the same technology. They did a couple bug fixes, but that's about it. But however, in SQL Server 2019, they added additional sources to it and added a lot of functionality to it. So now with this major update in SQL Server 2019, you can also connect to other SQL Server databases. So you can reach from one SQL Server database across virtual machines or across the internet to another SQL Server box and query tables from that SQL Server. You can also hook up to Oracle, Teradata, MongoDB, any ODBC connection. I have some clients where I've also hooked up Sybase, ProvideX, SAP HANA. That you can connect up to a lot of different resources. As I mentioned earlier, CSV files is another one that you can connect to. There's all kinds of different sources. It makes ingesting data into SQL Server way easier. So just kind of a little how it works or how it's structured. Polybase can be installed in a couple different configurations. One, it can be in a single server configuration where it's a standalone instance, and you would just use it like querying from SQL Server like you would any other database table, which I'll kind of show you in a little bit. And then Polybase also has scale-out groups. So this allows you to install Polybase across multiple SQL servers and distribute the queries across those different nodes. Each node with Polybase can support up to 8 readers. So you basically can have 8 different queries going at a single time off of one node. So if, in this example I took from Microsoft's website here, if you have 12 different queries going on at the same time, and you want to query a single source, it would split it up, 4 readers for each of the different different queries. So it would give you a total of 12 readers. So some of the reasons why I use Polybase, it majorly simplifies the ETL process. I do actually more of an ELT type of a process. So for those not familiar, ETL is an extract, transform, load. But in the data world, you can also do extract, load, and transform, which just basically means that you're extracting the data, loading it into your target system, and then doing the transform after it's been loaded. The nice part about Polybase is you can do either one. Previously, I was having to use SSIS, and I was always having a heck of a time while trying to transfer data. I basically got to the model where I was pulling the data and then just picking and choosing what data points I needed to bring in, and then dumping that into my target server, and then doing any transformations that I needed to do there, because it was way easier and way more efficient to do it once I loaded the data into my target system that was usually a bit beefier of a system. With Polybase, I just run scripts, and it allows me to manipulate the data even before I load it into the target table. So you can really go back more to that ETL type of a transformation. The other great thing is it virtualizes the data. So as the example I just mentioned, where I had to copy data from a source system into a target system, I'm duplicating the data locally then, because then I take that data, manipulate it more, and dump it into my data warehouse. So with Polybase, it just creates a virtualization layer over your target system. So you don't have to worry about pulling that data into a local system and duplicating it there before actually being able to use it. You can just directly use it through Polybase. This also helps out with things such as timing. So I don't have as many data concurrency issues where if I have a client, we're running ETL every 15 minutes, I don't have to worry about pulling all of that data over to my local, to my data warehouse server, and then manipulating that data and loading it in. And then the amount of time that I'm losing copying all of that data and running the extra manipulation. I've had issues where we've had concurrency where by the time the data gets loaded and we're trying to pull something else from another server, everything's out of sync. So by using Polybase, everything's real time. So there's very, very few chances of anything actually getting out of sync while we're trying to import data. I do still use SSIS, but I've learned to use it in a different fashion. At this point, I use it more for orchestration as opposed to extracting and loading data. A lot of the things that I do with Polybase is just stored procedures, and I use SSIS for orchestrating those stored procedures. The reason I do that instead of just running straight stored procedures through like SQL agent or something like that is with SSIS, you can do parallel runs basically. So you can have 6 different scripts running at the same time, all with Polybase queries and being able to pull data in at the same time concurrently. It just really allows us to optimize the speed of how fast we can make an ETL run. And also, it's easy to connect to other data sources. as I mentioned earlier, you can connect to SQL Server. On-prem, we even have a client where we connect to an AWS instance. They call it a data lake. It's really just a SQL Server. But we're able to reach across and pull data very quickly from them. I've also hooked up CSV files. I'll kind of show you how that works in a little bit, but basically it just treats a CSV file as a table in your database. So I'm going to kind of go through a little bit of setting up Polybase, kind of how it works, a couple of gotchas and things to kind of pay attention to while you're installing it. On the most part, it's pretty easy. It's definitely not a difficult system to set up. As mentioned earlier, it's just a separate service that you can install with SQL Server. 2016, 2017 have it. It's not near as built out as what it is in SQL Server 2019, though. It is available with enterprise and standard versions of SQL Server. It also is on Azure Synapse Analytics and parallel data warehouses. It can be installed on new or existing installations of SQL Server, and based upon which one you're installing it in, it can kind of have some gotchas on both ways. The only thing that's really important is having a good connection to the external data sources that you're trying to connect to. All right, so if we're setting it up, basically all we have to do is go into SQL Server. You would run your SQL Server Setup. You would run your setup with a normal install, do a nice, either add more features or do a new install. Whenever you're clicking through and get to the feature selection screen, you will choose the database engine, but the other one that you'll choose down there is Polybase Query Services for external data. I don't have it selected here, although I should, and that is Java Connector for HDFS data sources. I usually install that as well, mostly because if you're going to use HDFS, you need it. It isn't needed for most connectors, but it's good just to install, and also usually installation goes better. I've had a few different flavors of SQL Server 2019 installs where by not installing that Java connector, it actually crashes the install. So just something to be aware of if you're going to install and play with it. As mentioned earlier, you can install in both a standalone Polybase enabled instance or a scale out group. The standalone is usually what we work with. I've not really had any clients that have utilized the full-blown standalone instance yet. So, but Polybase scale out group is available for anybody who's going to be moving a lot of data. If you are installing in a scale out group, there is a specific port ranges that you have to enable in your firewall. Whenever you're installing, it will actually show you which port ranges that you need to have available in order for that to be able to work. So just keep in mind, if you're going to do that, you'll need to enable the firewall for letting traffic through those ports. The other thing is it can only be installed once per machine. So with SQL Server, you can install multiple instances of SQL Server on the same machine. However, Polybase is kind of a shared feature where it can only be installed one time. And after you set up Polybase, one thing that you'll need to do is enable the TCP/IP for the network configuration for SQL Server. In order to do this, you just go into the SQL Server Configuration Manager. You'll go to the SQL Server Network Configuration, click on the protocols, and the TCP/IP is usually disabled on the Standard Edition. I believe on the Enterprise Edition, by default, it's enabled. But if that is disabled, you'll need to enable it. Also, if you're running the Standard Edition, usually Polybase is stuck in kind of a not running state, which I believe I have on my next slide here again. So usually it will, oh, that's the firewall. So this will be stuck. If you look in the services for Windows screen, there you'll have your different Polybase services. There's 3 of them. and all three of them are stuck in a starting phase. If that's the case, you just need to stop all of them and stop your SQL Server instance after you've set this to enable, and then restart those services, and it should turn them on for you. As mentioned, there's 3 services, and you'll need to open up the TCP ports if you are going to use Polybase for multiple instances. If you're running it on the same instance as a single SQL server, though, you don't need to enable any firewall ports or anything. All right, so I am going to fire up a virtual machine here. And I have created a Jupyter notebook with a little bit of information and configuration, some different stuff for people to look through if you guys are interested. Like I said, I'll try to put this up on GitHub or something later for people to download. But this just kind of gives you kind of a quick start guide of getting an instance going. It has pretty much all of your configuration step by step, and I've put some descriptions of different things in here to make it a little bit easier to kind of understand what you guys are looking at and kind of how it works. So I'll kind of quickly go through this real quick before going into a demo of actually setting it up and running and everything. So when we first get started with Polybase, you have to enable it. When you enable it, it is on a per database instance. So if you are on a server and you have 15 different databases, when you enable Polybase, you only enable it on the database that you're wanting to use Polybase on. If you're wanting to use it on more than one database, you'll have to run the script on each one of the databases. After you run the little command to get it going, you can also check to make sure that it's running. Once Polybase is running on that database, you have to create a master key. This master key basically encrypts all of the information, statistics, all that kind of stuff later on in the process. So you have to create a master key in order to be able to get Polybase to work. I actually had an instance yesterday, I believe, where we had to rebuild a database server due to it crashing. And when we did that, we restored a database that had Polybase installed in it. And when we did that, Polybase was not working anymore because we had switched servers and the key no longer worked with the new server. In order to do that, we had to basically recreate the key. We used the same password it regenerated, but this is the code you use in order to do that. I thought it was pretty handy to throw in here in case anybody ever ran into that issue. So once you create your master key, in order to be able to access an external data source, you need to have a scope credential created. So scope credential is essentially just the credentials that you use to log into a remote system. So if you're logging into ProvideX or some other system, or even another SQL server with a SQL user, you would just run this statement and replace the username and the password with your SQL username and password. And again, since that database server crashed, we also figured out how to reset the username and password if that was ever needed as well. So I included that in here. So after you create your scope user, you will create an external database. So the external database, one way to think of it is kind of like a link server in the way that it works. But the external data source is really just kind of a shell that tells SQL Server how to access it. Other things that it includes is just different settings for the data source. Many different data sources have different options that you have to include in order to make it work, such as CSV files, as well as anything with ODBC connections. You can use DSNs in order to connect to the ODBC drivers that you have installed.
So in theory, you could use read-only routing if you have AG set up.
I'm sorry, say that again.
Could you, in theory, with these connection strings, set up for read-only routing to an AG availability group?
Yes, you should. So with the availability group, you would still be accessing, I mean, it appears as a single SQL Server instance, but yes, it would just be connecting to, so you would use it basically the same way that you would with SQL Server, unless it's using, let me see, let me think. Availability groups, I don't think they need the named server instance. Most of them are just usually the SQL Server. So as far as I know, yes, you should be able to just connect using SQL Server connection string here, and then just replacing the SQL Server portion of it with the availability group name. And then I'll show you here in a second where you actually type in the database name and stuff. So that sets up just, so that, like I said, this is just kind of at the server level. It's a link server. And then further down here, we'll create a actual external, there's the data sources. So as I mentioned, I've got SQL Server, ProvideX, SQL Anywhere. These are a couple of different examples that I've worked with in the past. So for Mass 90, got some Stage 100 customers. They use ODBC connectors to connect to them. I'll tell you, ProvideX is really slow using this, but I've used it with link servers as well, and it's pretty slow through that too. So, but here's some of the connection strings that you'll have to use. SQL Anywhere, it's really picky in the way that it's set up. SQL Server. So as I mentioned, with the external data source, you'll just basically create your name, and then for the location, you'll say SQL Server, and then here is where you would put that group name at. And then Credential is just the credentials that you use. So the SQL Server user that you created, the scoped user, would go here. And push down on. So push down is a feature that whenever you create a query and you add a predicate on there or where statement that you're wanting to use for filtering results coming back, if you turn push down on, what it does is it pushes that query or the filters to the remote system, or at least it tries to. It doesn't always, but it tries to. So if you're wanting to do just the top 1,000 rows, it'll try to push that, top 1,000 to the remote server, so not all of the rows in the table are returned to SQL Server before SQL Server actually filters out the rest of them and only returns you the top 1,000. However, if you keep the push down equals off, which there are some systems that you can't use the push down, but if you use the push down equals off, then whenever you try to, or whenever you do the query, it'll pull back basically all the results from that table before filtering out based upon whatever your query is. Another thing, I've had to connect to SQL Server, but a named instance, and there are some extra flags that you have, or connection options that you have to put in place whenever you're connecting to a SQL Server named instance as well. SAP HANA, I was actually surprised how easy this one is. It actually works quite well. So once you create the data source, and I'll show you guys all of this here in a little bit, an actual practical application. This is just kind of a high level and some of the different options that you guys can use. But after you create the external data source, then you'll create the external tables. And the tables are what you actually query. When you create these tables, they show up basically like just any other SQL Server table. In Management Studio, they are in a different area of the GUI, which I'll show you guys in a little bit. If you're using Azure Data Studio, they show up with all the other tables. They'll just have the words external table or external in parentheses next to the table name. But when you create these, basically what happens is you're creating a SQL Server external table. You'll have your columns and everything else on the table, and you have an extra section down here with, which gives you the location. So this location is the mapping of the table, the database, the schema, and the table that you're wanting to map to the local schema and table, and then what data source you're wanting to use. And once you do that, you can create statistics against these different tables. And that just helps SQL Server perform better queries against remote data, is really what it does. It basically creates like a local catalog of the remote data, whatever column that you do statistics against. That way it can just help SQL Server know kind of what order the data is in and that kind of stuff in order to be able to better create the query. All right, so here's my actual demo introduction of Polybase here. So before I do that, I'm going to flip over here to SQL Server Management Studio. I've got a script here. I'm going to go ahead and create a fresh database here so we can make sure that got a nice clean test environment to work with here. You see tables are empty. Nice fresh copy. So most of the Jupyter Notebook covers the same exact things here. I'm going to go ahead and use, switch this to test image. Okay, I'm going to create a local schema. So what I'm doing here, why I'm creating a new schema, is when working with these, I found it's a lot better to kind of keep the naming of the external tables for research later on while you're working with remote systems, because every system has their own way of naming tables and other stuff. I usually create a schema just to give me an idea of what system it's actually coming from. Excuse me. That way, as I create these external tables, I can just look at the table and know exactly what system it's coming from and have an idea of what the table is named in the remote system, so that if we go and look in the remote system, it's easier to track down, troubleshoot data, whatever that we're trying to do. So we created that. And then, like I said before, we need to create a user. So this user, AW user with this password, has access. So I'll actually pull it up here just so you guys can get a better idea of what I'm doing. So this AW user already exists, and I gave it read-only permissions to both my VentureWorks 19 and VentureWorks Data Warehouse 2019. That way we can pull data from it. So what I need to do in my local database, my test DWH here, I'm going to go ahead and create this scope credential. Oh, we skipped a step. So let me make sure that I am connected. Why are you not connecting? There it is. All right, so remember I said we have to enable Polybase first, so let's go ahead and enable Polybase. So it changed from 1 to 1, so it's enabled. Usually it says 0 to 1, but I set up a database earlier, so probably save the setting. Then we can check and make sure that it is indeed enabled. So is Polybase enabled? Okay. We are going to create the master key. All right, master key is created. So now that our master key is created, let's try this one again. All right, so now our master key is, or our scope credentials are created. So now we can create our data source. So as I mentioned earlier, we're just creating an external data source. We're going to call it AppWorks DB. The location is a SQL Server. It's on my local host. Pushdown is on. You really don't actually have to include this if you want it. It is on by default with SQL Server. I've asked Microsoft about other data sources, and they never gave me a good answer on it. From my understanding, some of them are on by default, some of them are off, some of them you have to distinguish. So usually I just explicitly tell it, turn it on or turn it off, based upon experience with it. By default, normally I leave it on. If I run into troubles where it's causing all kinds of performance issues and things are crashing. Usually you can turn it off. You have to rebuild the data source to do that, but you turn it off and usually it fixes issues. From my understanding, it just has to do a lot with the translation layer of what Polybase is translating your query into to send it to the remote system. And then credentials, I'm using these credentials that we just created. All right. Now I'm going to create an external table. So the table that I'm going to pull, I'm going to create the sales order header table. And I'm going to pull it from my AdventureWorks 2019 from the sales schema and sales order 2019. I'm going to run this, and you will notice I get an error. So this error is the following columns in the user-defined schema are incompatible with external table schema for table sales order header. So the problem is foo_int is not a proper columns for this table. Problem is with many systems, I don't necessarily have access to those systems to get into them, especially if they're ODBC or something. I mean, I could use like Excel or something like that to try to get in there, figure out what the table structure is, but then I need to figure out the data types. It's just a royal pain. So by running this script here, this makes it to where in this error, you can see user-defined column foo was not found on external table. However, the detected external table schema is, and it actually provides you the table schema of the table that you are trying to create. So I actually already got this script set up here where I've got it all pretty so you can see it. So you can see here, create external table. So I went ahead and did the sales order header and the sales order detail. I ran that, just basically cut and paste this here into over that foo_int to give me the actual columns that I wanted. Now, one thing that you will notice is if I do copy this, I'll just paste it here for illustration's sake for a minute. There are a lot more columns there. There's a lot of columns there than what I have here. So another neat thing about Polybase is even though there are 100 columns in the table, I don't have to pull all 100 of them. I can pull only the ones that are actually relevant to what I need. This just makes things cleaner as you're trying to dig through data. And then later on, if you need to add another column, you can go in there, destroy your external table, just run it, and include your new column in there. And any code that you've had running previously works perfectly fine. Unless you remove a column, then you might run into some issues. Okay, so here, a few things to mention. There are some issues with different system types when it comes to different data types. So one of the nice things about doing this method where I just basically had it give me what the schema is, it already tells me what the data types are, so I don't need to go in there and try to figure out, okay, and provide X decimal 12,0 is just, or numeric 12,0 is a decimal 12,0. Like, I don't need to know any of that stuff. It all does that for me here. It also tells us the collate in case your collation between your databases are different as well. So I'm going to go ahead and run the script. It ran successfully. Now over here in my test DB, like I mentioned before, you have tables. However, you notice when I refresh this, there are no more tables showing. However, there's this one called external tables. And if we open this up, you'll see these two new tables in here. If I just do a select 1000 off of it, there's the table from, or it's just pulled all the data from that AdventureWorks database. All right. So another, and like I said, you can also join across different tables as well, external tables. And it's fairly performant, pulled 121,000 rows in 4 seconds. So it's pretty decently fast. A few other, and as I also mentioned before, you can also run create statistics. SQL Server, I've noticed does not really do much. It might if you have more rows, but this 121,000, I tested it earlier just to see how much of a difference it makes in the performance query, and at a given point, it was about a second maybe. But you can also create statistics against the external tables. And you just basically pick a column that you're going to create the statistics against. With Polybase, when you create statistics normally, you can sometimes do sampling. There's a couple different ways that you can create statistics. When you're using Polybase, though, you have to use it with full scan, which goes out to the remote system, queries every row in that table for that column, and then returns it back to SQL Server so that it can create its statistics on the side. And for this particular instance, this was created pretty quickly. I was doing this earlier with 5 ProvideX tables from one SQL Server or one virtual machine to a Sage machine on a different environment. And it actually took about 4.5 hours to create 5 statistics on tables. It was pretty slow. It was kind of horrible. But most systems, it's actually fairly performant.
Kevin, this is Lee. Could you take just a moment, or would you mind taking just a moment and talking a little bit about what statistics are? I don't want to assume that everyone understands that or why you would want to do it.
I'm not super familiar with them. I have a general idea. Basically, what it boils down to is statistics is just kind of metadata that SQL Server stores in your SQL Server that it's kind of like an index, but not. It's the same idea, but implemented completely differently. So with indexing, you have your B tree and actually build your structure where it's easy for SQL Server to scan through. Since you can't index external tables, since you can't index them, what you have to do is create statistics, which basically creates kind of like a quasi index over the top of them. The other reason that you would use statistics is for things like views. Standard views you can't create indexes on. Now, index views, that's a different story, but your standard views you can't create indexes on. So what you would do instead is create statistics over them to help increase performance by giving SQL Server basically hints as of where the data is at, so that it knows how to build its execution plan for building a query to send across the pipe, basically through Polybase, to grab the data out of the remote system. Hopefully that makes sense.
Okay, yeah, I think it does. And I think statistics are partly also are about showing data distribution.
Yeah.
So it knows how many, how the values are distributed across a particular table, or it is similar to, or similar concept to an index. So, okay, thank you.
Yeah, they definitely are different, but conceptually they're fairly similar. And that really wraps up a lot of the demo that I have for Polybase. Is there any other questions or anything on anything I covered? No?
I don't see anyone asking me.
All right. So I do have the additional resources here. So here's just a little bit of information about Polybase. Not a ton of stuff, but their documentation's actually pretty decent. It's kind of lacking in a few places, but on the most part, it's pretty decent. I've been using Polybase for about a year now. The first couple versions of SQL Server 2019, I think through CU4, were a bit rough with Polybase. Some things would work well, other things randomly would just break. Things that it's just like, why is this breaking? It was pretty bad. Once they hit about CU5, though, things started getting way more stable. Matter of fact, one update that they had with Polybase, they ended up pulling the SQL Server update. I think it was CU2 or something like that. They ended up completely retracting it because it just caused so many issues and errors. But it's a lot more stable now. I really encourage people to play with Polybase. It's a great technology. It's really simple to use. Once you get it set up, it's really stable. I hardly ever have any issues with it at all.
I really liked the hint that you gave about creating external tables with a column of foo int. It might tie into what you just talked about in terms of the CUs and the different things that they've added or fixed. When I did this proof of concept for this to a IBM iSeries AS400 system about a year ago, it was painful because I had to actually go to and connect to the system and get the schema information. I don't know, I don't think I've patched that SQL instance. So I might try your foo int tip to see if it actually gives me the schema from the AS400 or not. And if it doesn't, then I may patch it and then try it again. But that's an interesting hint that I was not aware of, so I appreciate that.
Yeah, no problem. Yeah, that was one I just happened to stumble across. I was sitting there like, well, it's giving me the errors that I'm running into. So I wonder if it will actually just like give me the schema. So I checked it out. It did. I ran it. Works great. So another thing I was going to show you guys real quick. So Azure Data Studio, for anybody that uses it, as I mentioned, with the external tables, it'll show you the word external next to the tables, which will allow you to differentiate which ones are actually external tables versus which one are actually local tables.
Go on.
Oh, no, go ahead.
So if the external table on the other machine gets dropped or is in the middle of a restore or anything like that, will this throw an error or will it not know until you run a query?
When you run a query, it won't know until you run a query. It does everything live. So if somebody updates a table or something else on the external instance, until you run a query against it, it won't even know. And if everything is in place, whenever you run the query, like everything's completed and back to where it was, as long as they haven't dropped any columns or changed any data types, you'll be fine. Now, if they've changed a data type, then you might run into some issues because you'll come in here, do like a select 1000, it'll actually throw an error down here. At that point, you can pretty much figure out which one it is, just going through, telling it not to pull a row. Whenever you comment out the row that's actually throwing the error, it'll show up your regular results. So it's kind of a pain to troubleshoot, but not horribly bad.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome. So whenever you're building Polybase tables, I showed this demo to my company actually, and it failed miserably when it did it. So I'll point it out as a alternative way of doing this, but I don't highly recommend it at all. Inside of Azure Data Studio, you can install the data virtualization extension. And when you do, anything that has Polybase enabled on it will allow you to run this virtualized data wizard. And it allows you to connect to the server, Oracle, MongoDB, Teradata, basically say, yep, that's the one that has Polybase on it. And then you can give it the external information that you're trying to connect to, the server name, database server, if you know what it is. And then for here, you can create your credentials through this wizard. And later on in the wizard, it will pull up the different tables that you can query from, and basically we'll do all this stuff and build it out for you. So it just builds all of the SQL behind the scenes to run this for you. It works about 75% of the time. Oh, which reminds me, it also, whenever you're querying things, you can query both tables and views as well. So if you have multiple tables that you want to just expose on the other side easily, you can create a view on that side, or have whoever maintains that system create views on that side of it. And then you can just use Polybase to query those views directly. That might help with like performance issues and stuff if you can get them to create a view and index the columns that are joining on in the view and that kind of stuff. That's one way that you might solve some performance issues if you have any. Any other questions?
I was going to ask how you use this with Power BI. Didn't you say you use Power BI a lot?
Yes, yes, we do. So with Power BI, normally, so we do the full data warehousing. What we do with Power BI, I usually build an ETL process to customers' different disparate systems, and that data ends up flowing through Polybase and into the data warehouse. And then from there, we create views and stuff. And then we use SQL Server analysis services really for connecting Power BI to the data warehouse. We use that basically as like the presentation layer of the data warehouse. So Polybase is really just used behind the scenes for moving data. You can technically use Polybase for like create a view over your Polybase tables or querying data directly from a disparate data source, and then just hook up Power BI to that view. But when you're reloading data, depending on the data source, that can be super, super, super slow. But that's a few ways that we use it.
Okay, so you do most of the ETL outside of Power BI and then just kind of directly pull it in.
Yeah, yeah. And depending on what you're doing with Power BI, there's some instances where doing things inside of Power BI are just way easier to do and way more efficient. Then there's other instances where there's some things, especially with more complex data modeling, where trying to do it directly in Power BI is a pain. And then on top of that, it's not as centralized for, especially like small enterprises or medium-sized enterprises. They tend to like their data to where multiple people can access it pretty easily and access the same data that's set up the same way, so everybody's getting the same results, as opposed to multiple different Power BI reports that may be pulling from the same data source, but everybody's using maybe a different data point to calculate a calculation differently. So yeah, when we do it, normally we run things through the data warehouse and then hook Power BI up to a data warehouse or to SSIS that pulls data from the data warehouse.
Okay, thanks.
You're welcome. Anybody else have any questions? All right. Well, that is all I have, Lee.
Okay, I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording here at the moment then.